August 8, 1945. 1,100 hours in a makeshift interrogation room in Osca, where summer heat turned concrete cells into ovens, and the smell of sweat mixed with fear hung heavy in stagnant air. Captain Marcus McDilda, United States Army Air Forces, sat on a wooden stool facing three Japanese officers whose expressions conveyed the kind of focused intensity that came from men who knew their empire was dying and desperately needed information that might prevent total annihilation. His P-51 Mustang had been shot down the previous day during a strafing run over western Honshu, his parachute landing him in rice paddies where Japanese soldiers had captured him within minutes. Standard procedure dictated providing only name, rank, and serial number, the minimal information required by the Geneva Conventions, the baseline compliance that separated legitimate prisoners from spies subject to immediate execution. But the questions the Japanese officers were asking were not standard. They were asking about the atomic bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima 2 days earlier, asking about American capabilities, asking about whether more such weapons existed and where they might fall next. McDilda, 25 years old, a fighter pilot who had completed 37 combat missions and possessed exactly zero knowledge about atomic weapons beyond what he had read in newspapers before deploying overseas, understood that the interrogation room where he sat represented a decision point that would determine whether he survived the war or died in the next few hours. The Japanese officers believed he knew secrets. They believed American pilots were briefed on strategic weapons, that fighter pilots flying over Japan would have been told about atomic bombs and future targets. Their belief was incorrect. McDilda had no classified information, no strategic knowledge, nothing that would satisfy interrogators who needed answers that might help their dying empire. But he also understood that admitting ignorance would make him worthless, and worthless prisoners in August 1945 Japan were often shot rather than fed. So Marcus McDilda, fighter pilot from North Carolina who knew nothing about atomic bombs, made a decision that would influence the final days of World War II through consequences he could not have predicted. He decided to lie, to invent information so plausible that his captors would believe it, to become valuable through fiction when truth offered nothing except expendability. By August 8, 1945, the Pacific War had entered its terminal phase, though Japanese military leadership refused to acknowledge the mathematical certainty of defeat. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th had killed over 70,000 people in an instant, had demonstrated a weapon that changed the fundamental calculus of warfare, but it had not yet produced Japanese surrender. Emperor Hirohito's government debated terms, argued about honor and conditions, delayed while American planners prepared for Olympic. The invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for November, an operation that would dwarf D-Day and cost casualties estimated in the hundreds of thousands on both sides. In this context, any intelligence about additional atomic weapons, about American targeting plans, about how many such bombs existed, possessed value beyond normal tactical information. It could inform defensive preparations, could influence diplomatic negotiations, could shape the decisions that would determine whether Japan surrendered or fought to literal extinction. The Japanese officers interrogating McDilda expected what their training and experience had taught them to expect: that captured American pilots would resist, would provide minimal information, would need to be coerced through methods that range from psychological pressure to physical violence. What they did not expect, what their entire intelligence framework was not designed to detect, was an American pilot who would provide detailed, confident, completely fabricated information about the most important strategic weapon in history, delivered with enough technical plausibility that verification would be impossible in the time frame available. McDilda's interrogators asked the first question with professional directness. "What do you know about the atomic bomb?" The question was open-ended, designed to assess how much the prisoner knew before determining what specific information to extract. McDilda, calculating in the seconds available, recognized that claiming complete ignorance would end his value and probably his life. He needed to appear knowledgeable enough to be worth keeping alive but not so informed that his captors would become suspicious of why a fighter pilot possessed such sensitive information. "I know what every pilot knows," McDilda answered, his voice steady despite the fear that made his heart hammer against his ribs. "We were briefed before missions. They told us about the weapon, told us to avoid certain areas where additional bombs might be used. The statement was pure fabrication. No such briefings had occurred. Fighter pilots had received no information about atomic weapons. But it was plausible enough that Japanese intelligence, which had consistently overestimated American coordination and information sharing, would find it credible. The senior interrogator leaned forward. Where will the next bombs fall? The question was urgent, sharp with the kind of desperation that came from men whose cities were being systematically destroyed and who needed any information that might allow preparation or evacuation. McDilda had perhaps 5 seconds to invent an answer that would be believed, that would make him valuable enough to preserve but not so specific that it could be immediately verified as false. Kyoto and Tokyo, McDilda said, naming 2 cities whose selection he based on nothing except the logic that they were large, important, and obvious targets. We were told they're next on the list, maybe in the next few days. The lie was delivered with the confidence that came from understanding that his captors had no way to verify the information in the time available, that by the time his fabrication could be checked against reality, the war might be over, or he might be dead, or the chaos of Japan's collapse might make verification irrelevant. But the interrogators pressed for technical details. How many atomic bombs did America possess? How were they delivered? What were their specifications? Each question represented a decision point where McDilda had to invent plausible answers based on his general knowledge of weapons and aircraft, extrapolating from what he knew about conventional bombs to create a fictional framework detailed enough to satisfy interrogators who needed information, but who also lacked independent knowledge to check his claims against. The symbolic object that defined McDilda's interrogation was neither weapon nor document, but something more abstract. The lie itself, the fabricated information delivered with confidence, the fictional intelligence that became valuable through belief rather than accuracy. Throughout history, intelligence services had developed elaborate methods to extract truth from prisoners, had created frameworks for detecting deception, had trained interrogators to identify inconsistencies that betrayed fabrication. But McDilda's lies worked because they filled a desperate need, because his captors wanted to believe that captured American pilots possessed strategic information, because in the chaos of August 1945 Japan, verification was impossible and belief was easier than skepticism. McDilda told the Japanese interrogators that America possessed a stockpile of over 100 atomic bombs, a staggering overestimate of actual American capabilities, which in August 1945 consisted of exactly 1 additional bomb being prepared for use against Nagasaki. He described the bombs as being delivered by specially modified B-29 bombers flying from bases in the Marianas, accurate information that he could have gleaned from general knowledge of American bombing operations. He explained that the bombs used a uranium core, a guess based on newspaper articles he had read before deployment that mentioned atomic research involving uranium. He claimed that future targets included not just Kyoto and Tokyo, but also Osaka, Nagoya, and Yokohama, major cities whose selection required no special intelligence, just basic geographic knowledge of important Japanese urban centers. Each lie built upon the previous one, creating a framework of fictional intelligence that possessed internal consistency, if not external accuracy. The interrogators took notes, asked follow-up questions, pressed for details that McDilda provided through combination of invention and educated guessing. He described radiation effects based on what he remembered reading about X-rays in high school science classes. He explained blast radii using his knowledge of conventional bomb damage extrapolated to larger scale. He discussed American production capabilities by multiplying his observations of American industrial capacity by factors that sounded plausible but had no basis in reality. The transformation McDilda's lies achieved was both immediate and strategic. Immediately, they made him valuable, a prisoner who possessed information worth preserving, worth protecting, worth keeping alive, until his intelligence could be fully exploited. The interrogators, satisfied that they had extracted useful information, ordered him transferred to a POW facility rather than executing him as a war criminal, which was the fate that awaited many captured American airmen in the final months of the war. Strategically, though McDilda could not have known it at the time, his fabricated information contributed to Japanese decision-making in the critical days between Hiroshima and surrender. Japanese military intelligence. Receiving reports that captured American pilots claimed the U.S. possessed over 100 atomic bombs ready for immediate use, faced a psychological crisis that transcended simple military calculation. If the reports were accurate, continued resistance was not just futile but suicidal. Defending against conventional invasion was one thing, but defending against unlimited atomic bombardment was impossible. The intelligence reports based on McDilda's lies did not single-handedly produce Japanese surrender, but they contributed to the atmosphere of hopelessness that made surrender psychologically possible for leaders who had spent 4 years preaching death before dishonor. On August 9, 1945, the day after McDilda's interrogation, the United States dropped its second and last available atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 people and proving that Hiroshima had not been a singular demonstration but the beginning of a campaign that would continue until Japan surrendered. The bombing of Nagasaki, combined with Soviet entry into the Pacific War on August 8th, finally broke the deadlock in Japanese leadership. Emperor Hirohito made the decision to surrender, overruling military officers who advocated fighting to extinction. The announcement came on August 15th, 1945, 7 days after McDilda had sat in an interrogation room inventing information that he hoped would keep him alive long enough to be liberated. McDilda spent those 7 days in a POW camp near Osaka, unaware that his lies had been reported up Japanese intelligence chains, unaware that his fabricated claims about American atomic capabilities were being discussed at the highest levels of Japanese government, unaware that his desperate invention had become part of the information environment that shaped one of the most important decisions in modern history. When American forces liberated the camp on August 29, 1945, McDilda learned for the first time that the war had ended, that Japan had surrendered, that he had survived not through combat prowess, but through the kind of improvised deception that no training manual covered and no doctrine prescribed. What the Japanese interrogators expected on August 8, 1945, was that captured American pilots might possess useful tactical information about operations and capabilities, that coercive questioning might extract intelligence valuable for military planning, that the interrogation process would follow established patterns where truth was extracted through pressure and deception was exposed through inconsistency. What they experienced instead was a prisoner who understood that his value lay in appearing knowledgeable rather than being truthful, who recognized that lies delivered with confidence were more useful than honesty that offered nothing, who gambled that his captors' desperate need for information would overcome their skepticism about whether a fighter pilot would actually possess strategic intelligence about atomic weapons. The lies that kept McDilda alive represented a form of psychological warfare at the individual level. One man convincing an entire intelligence apparatus that he possessed knowledge he did not have, that his fabrications were intelligence rather than fiction, that the information he provided should influence strategic decisions. It worked because the Japanese needed to believe, because verification was impossible in the time frame available, because the alternative, accepting that they had no intelligence about American atomic capabilities, was more terrifying than accepting dubious information as fact. In the years following the war, McDilda rarely spoke about his interrogation, understanding that his lies, while they had saved his life, existed in the morally ambiguous space where survival imperatives met questions about the ethics of deception. When historians eventually documented his story, they noted it as a footnote to the larger narrative of Japanese surrender, a curious incident where one pilot's fabrications had contributed, however slightly, to decisions that ended the war. McDilda himself viewed it more simply. He had been captured. He had faced interrogators who could kill him. He had told them what they wanted to hear, because truth offered nothing except death. The deeper significance of McDilda's deception lay not in its immediate tactical impact, but in what it revealed about the advantage democratic military systems possessed in training personnel to think independently, to improvise when doctrine provided no guidance, to make individual decisions about when rules needed to be broken in service of survival. McDilda had been taught name, rank, and serial number as the baseline for prisoner behavior, but he had also been taught to think, to assess situations, to recognize that circumstances might demand deviation from prescribed responses. An authoritarian military system that demanded rigid adherence to procedure might have produced a prisoner who followed the rules and died for his compliance. The American system had produced a prisoner who understood that survival sometimes required creativity that transcended regulation. The lie itself, the fabricated intelligence about atomic bombs and targeting plans, represented the advantage that came from training that emphasized understanding over memorization, from education that encouraged questioning rather than blind acceptance, from a culture that valued the individual's judgment as much as any superior's orders. McDilda had not memorized lies to tell if captured. He had simply understood enough about weapons, aircraft, and strategic bombing to invent plausible fiction when the alternative was execution, had possessed enough confidence in his own judgment to deliver fabrication as fact, had recognized that in the chaos of August 1945 Japan, belief mattered more than truth. In the end, Marcus McDilda's survival through deception demonstrated that wars are decided not just by those with superior weapons or tactics, but by those who create systems that allow individuals to adapt when circumstances demand it, who train personnel to think creatively under pressure that no manual anticipated, who trust that individual warriors possess the judgment to know when following rules means death, and when breaking them means survival. The lies he told in that interrogation room on August 8, 1945, were neither heroic nor shameful but simply human, the product of a man who wanted to live, who understood that his captors needed information more than they needed truth, who gambled that fiction delivered with confidence would keep him alive long enough for history to make verification irrelevant. And he was right. The war ended 7 days later. The lies never needed to be proven or disproven, and Marcus McDilda went home to North Carolina carrying the knowledge that sometimes survival requires not fighting bravely or following procedure, but simply understanding your enemy's needs well enough to tell them exactly what they want to hear, whether it's true or not.